Abbess Mariam Soulakiotis, born circa 1883, died the 23rd of November 1954, born with the name Mariam Soulakiotis, known both to her followers as Mariam of Keratea, and in contemporary media pejoratively as Mother Rasputin, was a Greek Old Calendarist Eastern Orthodox abbess who was found guilty of numerous counts of serial murder, fraud and other crimes, which public prosecutors of the Kingdom of Greece alleged she committed against both laypeople and other nuns in her abbey between 1939 and her arrest in December 1950. During the time period of the crimes she was convicted of, Soulakiotis was neither a member of the mainstream Greek Orthodox Church nor in communion with the other, larger Old Calendarist group, the Floronites. She was a devoted follower of self-styled Archbishop Matthew Karpathakis of Vresthena, which both groups consider as schismatic. As more evidence and witness statements came to light, the indictment of Soulakiotis was revised repeatedly. In January 1951, when the head of mainstream Greek Orthodoxy, Archbishop Spiridon, failed to come to a peace with Old Calendarist Metropolitan Chrysostomos of Florina, a rival to Matthew, all Old Calendarist sects in Greece, including the Matthewites, were outlawed. The following month, the public prosecutor further indicted Soulakiotis, along with 13 other nuns and monks, on charges including homicide, fraud, forgery of wills, blackmail and torture, with Soulakiotis receiving the harshest indictment. Receiving multiple sentences over her 3 trials adding to a total of 14 years, Soulakiotis died in Avrov prison on the 23rd of November 1954. As she died before all of her criminal trials were done, she was only technically found guilty of 7 premeditated murders, as well as more than 100 negligent homicides due to offering free tuberculosis treatment that only consisted of staying at her monastery's high-altitude locale, not medical therapy. Excluding these negligent homicides, the typically agreed-upon total of her victims is 27, including them, 177. Soulakiotis was alleged to have committed her serial murders and other crimes in the Panagia Pevkovo-Nogiatrisa monastery, literally, the convent of the Virgin in the Pines, between Keratea and Kakithalossa, both in Lavraeotiki, East Attica. As of 2022, the Old Calendarist Abbey Soulakiotis once managed remains open and still has nuns who believe she was innocent and who venerate her as a saint. Some Greek Old Calendarists on Matthew's side of the schism, but abiding outside the convent in modern times, concur. Modern secular historians, however, reject the possibility of her innocence, based on the overwhelming number of witness statements and amount of evidence, although disagreement exists as to the true number of her victims. Section 1. Early life, between circa 1883 and circa 1900. Little is known of Soulakiotis' life before she became an Orthodox nun, except that she was a factory worker, and that she was born with the given name Marina circa 1883 in Keratea, Greece, which is around 50.6 kilometers, 31.4 miles, from Athens. Her childhood home, later converted into one of the monastery's buildings, was at number 71 Megalo Alexandro Street. Section 2. Religious life. 2.1. As Greek Orthodox nun, circa 1900 to circa 1923. Soulakiotis started as a nun in the mainstream Greek Orthodox Church, GOC, but soon became a close confidant of her religious spiritual father, Bishop Matthew Karpathakis of Vresthena. After the adoption of the new calendar by the GOC at the quote-unquote Pan-Orthodox Council of Constantinople of May 1923, Soulakiotis became an avid Old Calendarist and a follower of Bishop Matthew, now self-styled Archbishop Matthew of Vresthena, which both the mainstream Greek Orthodox Church and even many fellow Old Calendarists, quote-unquote true Orthodox Christians, considered as being in schism. As a nun, Mariam was called Mother, later Abbess, Mariam of Keratea. 2.2. Foundation of the Pevkovo-Nogiatrisa Monastery, 1923 to 1939. Mariam Soulakiotis, together with the hieromonk Archbishop Matthew Karpathakis of Vresthena, founded the Panagia Pevkovo-Nogiatrisa Monastery in 1927. The monastery is located between the town of Keratea and the rural Mediterranean village of Kakithalossa, both located in the municipality of Lavraeotiki, in the region of East Attica. The monastery was officially founded to honor the entrance of the Theotokos into the temple, that is to say, the presentation of the Virgin Mary, but Matthew also made clear that the goal of the monastery is to support the nascent Old Calendarist movement financially. At the monastery's founding, Matthew was already 66 years old. Plans for the monastery had been a few years in the making. In April 1925, Soulakiotis additionally acquired 7 acres of land, and later that year, she acquired 2 more plots of land. Greek author Nina Kouletaki writes that even after having reviewed "long and sympathetic" Matthewite histories of the monastery, there is no legal explanation as to how the nuns acquired the money to make such expensive property purchases. The monastery's full Greek name, Hieromoni Asodion Ponogios Pevkovonogiatrices, can be translated as Monastery of the Entrance into the Temple of the Most Holy Theotokos, the Healer, on the Pine Mountain. An Australian newspaper, The Sun, translated it in 1954 as the Convent of the Virgin in the Pines. Part of the reasoning for its name was that the convent was open to offer tuberculosis treatment, owing to the purported health benefits of its high-altitude, mountainous locale, to those who could not afford conventional treatment. In 1938, the convent began marketing itself as a free-of-charge tuberculosis treatment center. 2.3 Founding Nuns. The founding nuns were 1. Mariam Soulakiotis. 2. Irene Euphrosini Mendronou. 3. Maria Markaria Songari. 4. Panagiota Dionysia Vonisokku. 5. Maria Fomeli. 6. Asimina Zina Tampakaki. 7. Eleni Singlitiki Karpathaki. Section 3 Rise to Power. While Soulakiotis' official tenure as abbess began in 1950, she had already been doing the work of an abbess since 1939, assuming full responsibility for the monastery, when Archbishop Matthew was aged 78. Matthew left all day-to-day operations to her, as he was for some of that time in prison, and for the rest of it, as a hieromonk, seeking spiritual rewards for severe ascetic monastic practices, such as 40-day fasts, voluntary stays in deprived isolation cells, and tying heavy metal chains to his body to be carried around at all times. 3.1 Decline of Matthew's health, circa 1939 to 1950. Matthew's health is said to have begun declining during World War II, leaving him even less able to effectively supervise Soulakiotis, and making him more dependent on her. When Matthew's health started to seriously fail in 1950, Soulakiotis' already considerable influence over him grew in turn. Soulakiotis is therefore sometimes portrayed negatively even in Eastern Orthodox Church histories. One author of such a history, Vladimir Moss, relates a story where she is said to have prevented Matthew from saying something on his deathbed to Metropolitan Chrysostomos of Florina, a fellow Old Calendarist bishop, but one with whom he was in schism, after Matthew tried to sit up out of deference to Metropolitan Chrysostomos and began to try to speak inaudibly. Soulakiotis, it is claimed, burst into the room at that moment with a group of other nuns and demanded Metropolitan Chrysostomos and his entourage leave at once. Matthew would die only a few days later, so it is unknown if he wanted to heal the schism with Chrysostomos, a deathbed conversion of sorts. After the death of Matthew, Soulakiotis succeeded him as abbot of the monastery. During this period of her life she was described and photographed wearing an even more chaste version of the typical epimandilion, a Greek-style black epinokalimavkion worn by Eastern Orthodox nuns of the highest rank, who cannot rise higher as they cannot become ordained priestesses, which entirely covered her forehead and eyebrows. Section 4 Crimes. Soulakiotis' alleged modus operandi was to encourage wealthy women to join the convent, and then torture them until they donated their fortunes to the monastery. Once the money was donated, Soulakiotis would embezzle it and in some cases kill the donor. Beginning in 1940, after establishing control over the other nuns in the monastery's convent, she was said to have even sent the monastery's monks around Greece in search of wealthy "spinsters, widows, and families" to convert. Reuters reported that at the time of her arrest she had amassed 300 homes and farms across Greece this way, along with, quote, gold and jewels worth thousands of British pounds. Quote, £2,000 is equivalent to £70,060 in 2020. One of her accusers, Eugenia Margetti, said she was held in an isolation cell and tortured until she surrendered property worth 118 million drachmas, $80,000 in 1952, equivalent to $779,649 in 2020. Soulakiotis first came to the attention of police when an anonymous complaint was made by the daughter of a wealthy woman who had willed all her property to the monastery. She insisted that her mother wouldn't have done this without being forced, and accused the monastery's administration of blackmail and threats. Soulakiotis further faced police scrutiny when they were searching for an 18-year-old woman from Toledo, Ohio but born in Greece, Simila Spirides, who first went missing in 1949. The United States Federal Bureau of Investigation had traced Spirides to the monastery, and her father, Christos Spirides, called on Greek authorities from Ohio to take action, claiming that his daughter was lured to the convent by a nun he identified as Mariam Soulakiotis, who he said had been in the United States to collect property worth $10,000 left to the monastery. However, the Associated Press reported that Spirides was able to get into contact with his daughter after their initial reports, omitting whether or not she had been in the convent. The prosecution further alleged that Soulakiotis' strict adherence to ascetic practices among those in the convent led to the unnecessary deaths of 150 people who had sought treatment at the monastery for tuberculosis from it. They also alleged that the only time doctors were allowed on site was to sign death certificates, never to carry out medically supervised treatment of the deadly communicative lung infection. Victims of Soulakiotis' administration of the monastery who were still alive in the 1950s also variously accused her of torturing them, starving them, falsely imprisoning them, and beating them. Section 5. Arrest. More than 85 police officers first raided the monastery's grounds on the night of December 4, 1950, accompanied by a deputy prosecutor, a judge, and a coroner, in an operation which lasted all night. Upon gaining entry, they forcibly removed all 36 children on the premises, having to wrest away the hands of nuns, to orphanages where their future was not much better. Police also freed several half-naked, malnourished and sick elderly women tied up in basements, and were disturbed at the poor quality food served to those in the convent. Section 6. Trials. Although extremely concerned, due to questions over the voluntary nature of monasticism, the initial charges prosecutors felt they could prove carried light sentences: illegal export of olive oil to Cyprus and illegal import of tires. As more evidence and witness statements came to light, the indictment of Soulakiotis was revised repeatedly. When Archbishop Spiridon Vlachos of Athens failed to reconcile with Metropolitan Chrysostomos of Florina, although he was not in communion with either Soulakiotis or the deceased Matthew, all Old Calendarist sects in Greece, including the Matthewites, were outlawed in January 1951. The following month, the public prosecutor further indicted Soulakiotis, along with 13 other nuns and monks, on charges including homicide, fraud, forgery of wills, blackmail and torture, with Soulakiotis receiving the harshest indictment. At her trials, Soulakiotis wore an Orthodox icon depicting the deceased Matthew, who among some Greek Old Calendarists is honored in death, glorified, by referring to him by the posthumous name, Father, St. Matthew the New Confessor. 6.1. Defense arguments. At trial, Soulakiotis' attorney, Panos Panayiotikos, said in her defense that people surrender all their material property to monasteries when joining as a matter of course, a vow of poverty. He said that the properties were put in Soulakiotis' personal name simply because there was no legal person behind the monastery. In furtherance of their defense, Panayiotikos also showed a letter by Field Marshal Harold Alexander, which he claimed thanked the clergy of the Ponagia Pevkovonogia monastery for heroically risking themselves to aid the escapes of multiple British soldiers in the midst of the Axis occupation of Greece during World War II. 6.2. Specific murders tried. Only accounted for in this section are the murders Soulakiotis was convicted of before her death. She had pending unresolved cases. Soulakiotis was found guilty of the following 7 murders in particular between her 3 trials. Mr. and Mrs. Bakers. The Bakers family, originally having 5 members, 2 adults and 3 children, were convinced by Soulakiotis to join the monastery and at first voluntarily surrendered their property. When Mrs. Bakers realized the terrible conditions of the monastery, she informed the nuns she wanted to leave with her children. Not willing to part with the considerable wealth owned by the Bakers family, Soulakiotis condemned her to live in solitary confinement in a tuberculosis-ridden cell for 6 months, with little food. When Mrs. Bakers emerged, she fell into a coma and died soon afterwards. Her husband met the same fate. Mr. and Mrs. Panagiotopoulou. Forced to sign over their home to Soulakiotis, both died of starvation in the monastery. Ms. Michaelekou fell ill with tuberculosis and decided to try the monastery as it offered free treatment. Was given no treatment nor seen by a doctor, and was locked in a cell in which she died after signing over the title to her property. Sister Theodot. After being accused of misconduct by Soulakiotis, she was ordered beaten as a penance. The nuns who carried out Soulakiotis' orders beat her to the point of internal hemorrhage which caused her death. Sister Maria landed in hospital after a similar beating as was handed out to Sister Theodot, where she died. Section 7. Verdicts. Soulakiotis denied all the charges against her until her death, deriding them as "satanic fictions." She was said to have accepted all of her criminal sentences "without emotion," only crossing herself and saying a quiet prayer of vengeance to Saint Matthew. All told, Soulakiotis received 3 sentences at separate trials, one between 1951-2, and 2 in the year 1953, the last ending mere months before her death. At her first trial, she received a sentence of 26 months, at her second, 10 years concurrently, and at her third, 4 additional years consecutively. Section 8. Religious following. Described as a cult leader, Soulakiotis had more than 400 followers living in the monastery at the peak of her power. Furthermore, state records showed that 500 people willed all their property to the monastery and later died in it, which prosecutors asserted was an unusually high number for a legitimately operated monastery of its size. In 1951, after her arrest, her followers marched in protest at her detention, demanding that their leaders be given back to them. This led police to protect the home of Archbishop Spiridon, who they said the old calendarists were planning to kidnap in retaliation, with the goal being to hold him hostage until the civil authorities released Soulakiotis. Section 9. Death. Having received multiple different sentences over her 3 trials adding to a total of 14 years, Soulakiotis died in Avrov prison on the 23rd of November 1954. Reports conflict as to her age, but Reuters and News Beast give her age upon her death as 71. Section 10. Aftermath. Even after Soulakiotis' death, her sect continued underground despite having been outlawed. Police were investigating cases of young girls vanishing into thin air which they believed led to the rebel Karatia convent as late as 1959. In 1961, police stated that they did not know who had taken over from Soulakiotis, stating that the monastery's new presumed abbess had perfected the art of making herself and her pseudo-sacred sisters vanish without a trace. As of 2022, the old calendarist monastery Soulakiotis once managed, Karataya's Ponagia Pevkovonogiatrisa monastery, remains open and still has members who believe she was innocent and who venerate her as a saint. Old calendarism is no longer an illegal sect in modern Greece, as standards have improved to a level acceptable to the Greek civil authorities, and as an EU member Greek citizens enjoy the freedom of religion. Section 11. Legacy. The number of Soulakiotis' victims is a matter of some debate. The most commonly cited figure of 27 murders and 150 negligent homicides from tuberculosis comes from medical testimony during her trial. Authorities, however, at one point claimed she had killed more than 500. As during Soulakiotis' day, tuberculosis treatment was still new, and was a problem throughout Greece, it's unclear the degree to which Soulakiotis was involved in the negligent homicides she was convicted of in 1952. Some modern English-speaking Matthewite writers, such as Father Constantine Corris, assert that Soulakiotis was innocent and unjustly tried. At least since 2008, none of the monastery's current nuns were personal witnesses of what took place between the 1930s and the 1950s at the monastery, yet they continue to pray for the intercession of Soulakiotis, whom they call Holy Mariam of Keratea, all the same, as they regard her martyred in the cause of Christ. Explanations in support of her innocence offered by nuns contemporary to Soulakiotis included the idea that male bishops and monks were "jealous" of the wealth and power held by the female Soulakiotis, and were instead guilty of the crimes they accused her of. Another is that the number of deaths was simply attributable to the fact that many who joined the monastery, were already old, According to Nina Kouletaki in her 2019 Greek-language treatise on female serial killers, murderesses, it is only by happenstance that the monastery used the old Julian calendar rather than its revised form. She opines that at the time a cunning, shrewd abbess like Soulakiotis would have had equal success regardless of her brand of Greek Orthodox Christianity. In his 1992 exhaustive academic listing of female serial killers, entitled Women Serial and Mass Murderers, Kerry Seagrave writes that the prosecution established to his satisfaction the veracity of the number of victims as being at least 177. Section 12. In popular culture. 2 episodes of Greek crime drama Anatomy of a Crime were inspired by the case of Soulakiotis, although not directly naming her or the monastery, Purgatory of Season 1, and The Third Commandment of Season 2. Both aired on ANT1, the first in February 1993, the second in April 1994. Section 13. See also, Wikipedia article titles. Old Calendarists section Greece, Timeline of Eastern Orthodoxy in Greece, 1924 to 1974, Delphine Lalaurie, Elizabeth Bottery, Dorothea Puente, List of serial killers by country, List of serial killers by number of victims. For the sources of this audio recording, please see the article titled Mariam Soulakiotis, its final section titled References, on the English-language version of Wikipedia, the glorious free encyclopedia. I have been an Amazon Polly voice, Amy, narrating an article that was chiefly the work of Frederick R. Brennan, username Psihedelisto on Wikipedia.